We are ready. Very good. So, good morning, everyone. I'm so sorry for this small delay of some minutes. We had some last-minute technical problems. Today, we have the pleasure of listening to David Brewster. David Brewster, he has been with the SADF Board of Editors for quite some time. He has been helping us a lot pro bono. But what he does mainly, he is a senior research fellow at the National Security College. He focused on security in India and the Indian Ocean region, and also in the Indo-Pacific maritime affairs. He has been writing very, very often on these issues. I think that he became one of the leading, at least, experts on this issue. And he gave us the honor of being with us today exactly to discuss his last publication, a publication where he is analyzing the rivalry between India and China in the region, in the light of the present virus crisis. It is a very interesting topic. We will listen to him, and then we will have a period of questions and answers. We will accept written questions that you can address through the Zoom system, and we will be open for a discussion. We will have our next webinar next week with Professor Christophe Jaffrelot, Thursday next week. It's going to be a very interesting discussion as well on the economic conditions of the recovery post-virus. And we will now, without further delay, give the floor to David Brewster. He is in Sydney, so good afternoon to you. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone, according to the place where you are. We are now going to listen to him. Please, David, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Paolo, and it's a great pleasure to be joining the SADF again. I think I've been associated with the SADF for quite a number of years now, and I think it's a fantastic organisation doing a great job in raising awareness about these issues in Europe. So without knowing exactly the level of expertise of the audience here, I'll just start out by noting that those who follow the strategic competition and the strategic position in the Indian Ocean will be aware of the growing strategic competition we're seeing between the major powers, and in particular between India and China, who are really probably the principal players there. The United States plays a bit more of a restrained role in that part of the world. And so what I'm going to be looking at today is talking or thinking about the potential impacts of the COVID crisis on the Indian Ocean region. And I'll start with a little bit of a roundup or a summary of how COVID has impacted several countries in the region, and then look at how India and China have responded to the crisis in terms of what we could call COVID diplomacy, and then take a bit of a longer term look at what the COVID crisis might mean for the region and the position of these major powers in the region. So let's start with a bit of a quick summary on the impact of COVID on the Indian Ocean region. And obviously the crisis is still very much playing out. So, you know, we really can't be too sure about the longer term impacts, but I think at the moment, at least in my view, one could say that the impact on South Asia and the rest of the region is probably less severe than many people feared, and certainly less severe than what Europe and the United States has experienced. And that's both in terms of number of cases and number of deaths. For example, India, 1.3 billion population, has so far around 100,000 cases, 3,000 deaths. Bangladesh, around 23,000 cases and 300 deaths. Obviously, they're just the official figures and very likely severe underreporting. But I think there is, at least so far, there are some grounds for optimism about what is happening. South Asia and the Indian Ocean region generally tends to have a very young demographic, which works in its favour in this disease. It's got relatively high levels of social resilience, I think, compared to a number of Western countries, and reasonably good food security. So I think, you know, there are reasons for optimism. There's also a lot of reasons for caution. So, for example, we've started to see the first cases, COVID cases, in the Rohingya refugee camps in Bangladesh, and we should assume that slums in cities such as Dhaka and Mumbai, there will be significant caseloads. We've also seen some elements in India using COVID to stoke communal tensions. Now, the Indian Ocean island states have also done reasonably well. For example, Sri Lanka, 1,000 cases and 9 deaths. Seychelles, 11 cases and I think no deaths. So again, that's at least so far some grounds for optimism. Unfortunately, the economic picture for the region is far less optimistic than the health picture. Many or most Indian Ocean states are economically fragile and have relatively high debt levels, and they will really be severely impacted by falls in trade and commodity prices and tourism. So particularly for the island states, countries like Maldives, some 60% of its exports and 28% of its national income come from tourism. Similarly, Seychelles and Sri Lanka have very high levels, and Mauritius have very high levels of tourism in terms of national exports and income. And we should expect that to essentially more or less disappear for at least the next 12 months, if not longer. Other countries in the region also have a significant reliance on commodity exports, and we know that the prices of many commodities have fallen significantly. So countries like Mozambique will be hurting a lot. So overall, health picture fairly good, but there will be a huge economic hole in the economies of many, even not most, Indian Ocean states. So how have China and India responded to this? Well, their initial responses have involved largely symbolic efforts through provision of symbolic levels of medical aid, but that will fairly soon shift to issues of economic assistance. And here is where I think really the rubber hits the road, and it's where India will be at a very significant disadvantage to China in that regard. So through April, through much of April, as in many other parts of the world, we saw China engaging in so-called face mask diplomacy throughout the region. and so it donated relatively small amounts of testing kits and protective clothing to a number of countries, and also at the same time made fairly large amounts of commercial sales of equipment, some of which are rather questionable quality, and we've seen that in a number of places through the world. India characteristically responded to the crisis in its own way, really, and it saw itself as an opportunity to position itself as a net security provider to the region. So India sent supplies of hydroxychloroquine to many countries in South Asia, and just recently on a naval vessel carrying hydroxychloroquine as well as Ayurvedic medicines to a number of Indian Ocean states. And both of these medicines or remedies are touted by some Indian authorities as remedies for COVID. Some of India's efforts have bumped up against regional sensitivities. So reports, for example, that Indian Army medical teams were being sent to a number of countries in South Asia to provide assistance provoked really quite sharp responses from countries like Bangladesh and Sri Lanka and Afghanistan to the effect that the Indian Army was not required in their countries. And that was just really playing to domestic nationalist sensibilities and fears about the Indian Army. But overall, even if some of these really soft power and largely symbolic moves were appreciated in some countries and not in others, I think it's fair to say that their effects were probably fairly transient. And really the important story is how, at least in this regard, is how China and India address the impact of the COVID crisis in economic terms in coming months and years. So, as most of us know, the Indian Ocean region is really a significant focus for China's Belt and Road initiative. And I think the COVID crisis has really a very, could severely damage China's plans, or at least very significantly alter them. So a major economic downturn, including a downturn in trade, will likely have a significant impact on the need for new infrastructure, and as well as the feasibility, the economic feasibility of recently built infrastructure. And so we're likely to see in coming months and years a number of projects that had been planned put into the deep freeze, as well as a number of countries finding it increasingly difficult to service their debt loads to China. So this is almost inevitably going to put a large dent in the BRI, and that's even assuming that China will continue to be willing to lend on BRI projects at anywhere near the same level as it has in previous years. So I think increasingly China, faced with these problems in terms of debt servicing, is going to come up against, has several options available to it. In many cases, it will need to decide whether it makes fresh loans to refinance existing loans, to reschedule existing loans, to reduce interest or extend repayments out for many more years, or in some cases, potentially to foreclose on loans that are under default. And obviously, that could involve China taking control of infrastructure, and we saw how controversial that was, at least in Hambantota Port in Sri Lanka, where China effectively took control of that port following Sri Lanka's difficulties in repayment of the loans. obviously Beijing is very much aware of the controversies attached to foreclosure. So we'll just have to see how that plays out. So China has already indicated some willingness, in principle at least, to provide debt relief to some low-income countries. It has also indicated that it's unwilling to write debt off, that it just wants to reschedule debt. And so it remains to be seen how much debt relief China is willing to give. And importantly, whether it's going to be asking for strategic quid pro quos in return for providing debt relief. Importantly, the provision of widespread debt relief is also likely to reduce the willingness of Chinese lenders to make further loans on future projects. So this crisis, which certainly wasn't factored into China's lending plans, will, I think, affect the BRI in many different ways. So just in terms of looking at a few of the countries' responses, Pakistan, despite some very significant disruptions to projects over the last several months caused by the difficulties in Chinese obtaining Chinese workers or having Pakistani workers work on the projects, the Pakistan government has really indicated that it's forging right ahead with the CPEC, and indeed it's probably going to even, I would say, double down, if you like, on the CPEC in light of its other financial difficulties, and how much political capital the Pakistan government has staked on the success of the project. Nevertheless, at the same time, the Pakistan government has asked China for debt rescheduling on perhaps around $30 billion worth of projects. And I would expect that, given the importance of the CPEC as the flagship BRI project to China, that China will be under Beijing will be under very significant pressure to agree to significant debt rescheduling to Pakistan. Elsewhere in South Asia, we've seen China has made some reports of $500 million loan. I've seen other reports of $700 million loan on concessional terms to Sri Lanka. And according to some reports, China has also offered similar loans, or been requested at least for similar new fresh loans or debt rescheduling by countries such as Bangladesh, Nepal and Maldives. As I mentioned, Bangladesh has also announced that it's requested debt rescheduling on several BRI projects. So it'll be very interesting to see how China handles this. It's been very keen on keeping all discussions on a bilateral basis, where it obviously has the leverage, but it'll be interesting to see, for example, whether local countries want to start grouping together to negotiate debt rescheduling. It'll be interesting to see how much concern China has for its soft power in the region in responding to these negotiations. Clearly, if it was paying hardball, it'll do China a lot of damage. But on the other hand, if China is willing to write off very large sums of money, then that could reinforce a positive image for Beijing in the region. And just thinking back to the Asian financial crisis some 20 years ago, Beijing's quite generous response to that was really gave it a lot of credibility and positive soft power for some years after that crisis. And so it may well make a similar strategic decision about existing loans. Yet another impact of the crisis is on the BRI is that the really quite stringent economic circumstances in the future is very likely to focus the minds of both borrowers and lenders about future projects. And so we could possibly expect future BRI projects to be on a more economically sustainable, economically feasible basis than many of the projects that we saw in recent years. So what has India's response been in terms of the economic side? As I mentioned, we've seen India providing some symbolic assistance to South Asian countries and the island states in terms of the chloroquine tablets and the Ayurvedic medicines, but really if it is to demonstrate regional leadership, it's going to have to put its hands very, very deeply into its pockets in terms of providing economic assistance. So we've seen reports of apparently a $400 million currency swap agreement that India has provided or offered to Sri Lanka, and also the release of actually really what was a previously agreed $150 million currency swap agreement with the Maldives. That's as far as I'm aware. I haven't seen reports of very significant amounts of financial assistance elsewhere. And indeed, India's very constrained financial circumstances, remembering that India is still in lockdown while China has come out of lockdown, it will make it very hard, I think, for India to compete with China across the region. And indeed, I think what we'll see is India having to prioritize the countries that it assists and find ways in which it can provide assistance in the most effective way possible. As we've seen before, I think it's also very likely that Delhi will be forced to rely on Japan as a source of funds in order to balance China's influence in the region. And so we've already seen, I think, recent loan of around $1 billion by JICA to Bangladesh. And we've also seen the Japan-sponsored Asian Development Bank recently triple its COVID-19 assistance facility to $20 billion. So Japan will be coming in offering both bilateral economic assistance and also on a multilateral basis. But overall, I think, at least my assessment is that India, although in some ways many countries who were concerned about the level of Chinese influence in the Indian Ocean region could see this as a bit of an opportunity to rebalance the scales, India will find it very difficult to do so because of its own very constrained financial circumstances. And that's where other wealthier countries may need to step in, certainly as their economies start to open up again post-COVID and their financial situation becomes clearer. I've mentioned Japan as a significant source of finance for these countries as an alternative to China. I think many countries will also be looking to Europe for some level of assistance, and I'm certainly not an expert in the EU's plans in terms of the infrastructure facilities that it had established to, as an alternative, really to provide alternatives to the BRI. But I would expect that there's going to be a lot of calls on those facilities by a number of countries as they find it they get into debt difficulties with China. And as I said before, in my view, although we're all suffering very deeply from COVID, we should, rather than seeing this necessarily all in bad terms, we should also try and find ways to look at it as an opportunity to rebalance the scales. We can see that China will be struggling in terms of its plans for the BRI. And I think there will be opportunities for determined other players to step in and help reshape the region or rebalance the region. So I'll leave it there. Thank you, Paolo.
David, thank you very much for your comprehensive lecture. We have, in fact, a lot of questions here. I will try to organize them in groups. I think that most of them, they go on issues that you already touched, but perhaps they call a bit for some precisions. The first group of questions, two questions, which are fundamentally geopolitical, concern, on the one hand, by Dr. Siegfried Wolf from SADF. He asks you, what do you think that the quadrilateral security dialogue might have as a role in helping India on giving a positive answer to these challenges of COVID. And at the same time, we have Ms. Zara Beg. She is a researcher in the European Institute for Asian Studies that speaks about the string of pearls, which is fundamentally the way that the defense side of the China projection in the region is seen. And how do you see, well, you spoke a lot about what this crisis could mean for China in global terms, but what do you think this could mean specifically as challenges for the European Union?
Okay, they're great questions. I'll start with the string of pearls question, if I may. Look, I think before the COVID crisis struck, we were starting to see quite a fair amount of pushback against China's efforts to build and potentially take control of various ports in the region. And you could name quite a number of ports, whether they be Hambantota in Sri Lanka, Kyaukphyu in Myanmar, Gwadar in Pakistan, Bagamoyo in Tanzania, and several other ports, where some analysts were concerned that China would build the port and impose an unsustainable debt burden and take control of the port, and ultimately those ports could be used for military purposes. Now, we obviously saw that happen to some extent in Hambantota in Sri Lanka, where, as I mentioned before, a Chinese company stepped in to take effective control of that port, although we haven't seen any military use of that port yet by the Chinese military. But that action in itself, I think, raised a lot of concerns within the region. So this is going back to pre-COVID, We saw Myanmar renegotiate the terms of the Khartoum port to make it much more economically sustainable. We saw Tanzania basically cancel plans for the Bagamoyo port on the basis that it was the terms being provided were really unacceptable to it. So we already saw that regional pushback on the so-called string of pearls. Now, the COVID crisis could lead us in two directions, I suppose. One direction is that China gets further there's further pushback on China's strategic plans if borrowers really, it comes home to borrowers, the economically unsustainability of a lot of these projects and the concerns about so-called debt trap diplomacy. That could certainly happen. On the other hand, we could even see it going the other way. We're going to have a lot of desperate countries in the region, economically desperate countries, and it wouldn't be difficult for Beijing to look around, find an economically weak and desperate government, do a deal in which they gave them debt relief or debt write-offs for strategic benefits. So, you know, I can't pick it at the way at the moment, and certainly, you know, to a significant extent, will be driven by how much Beijing is willing to further invest, further money it's willing to throw at this in order to get strategic gains. And obviously the responses of other states. So thanks also for the question on the quadrilateral security dialogue. As we know, really this has been really much more symbolic than substantive. The four countries involved, India, the United States, Japan and Australia, all have increasingly close strategic connections, whether bilaterally or on a trilateral basis. The quadrilateral arrangement was fairly symbolic, and I think only really had one meeting among foreign ministers last year, which really didn't have a huge amount of substance to it. But nevertheless, I think overall the COVID crisis will really be a test for the quadrilateral, whether it is actually a meaningful alignment or not. If the quadrilateral does nothing, then I think it wouldn't have much credibility at all. You know, obviously, if it does something, then that will be to its benefit. I think Japan, in my view, Japan and probably Australia would be keen on building a multilateral response through the Quad. I think the big open question is to what extent the US administration is willing to move beyond its domestic focus and be interested in actually doing something on a multilateral basis in response to the crisis. Unfortunately, the indications so far have not been good. We haven't really seen, I'm not aware of any significant multilateral efforts by the United States to organize a response to the crisis. But that's not to say it's not going to happen. I think certainly, you know, it's foreseeable that Japan and Australia and India and perhaps other like-minded states, I would include France and potentially the EU in those categories, could build a multilateral response to the crisis. And I think this is a great opportunity for those countries to do so. They should not necessarily wait for US leadership. They should act and if the United States decides to come along with them, then that would be great. I can't give you a specific answer on the EU other than a response from a regional response from the EU would be sorely desired. Certainly, a great number of countries in the Indian Ocean region look to France for leadership, particularly among the island states. And I would expect that France will show some regional leadership. I think, as I mentioned before, I think the EU and other countries should really see this as more of an opportunity rather than necessarily simply in terms of a burden, because we will be seeing, as I said, a lot of regional states economically hurting, and they will be looking for alternatives to China in terms of helping them through this economic crisis. And to the extent that the EU and its partners can be part of that response, then I think it will get them a lot of long-term benefits.
Thank you very much, David. Now, a specific question that is coming from Professor Dentinho, that is with us. He is responsible for regional cooperation research in South Asian Democratic Forum. He is a professor in University of the Azores, and is asking if you know something on China presence in the banking systems of South Asian countries. There is something you can say about
that? I have to say I don't, and I'm not actually specifically aware of a strong presence in. I believe that China does have a presence within the Sri Lankan banking system, but I'm not aware of a significant presence within India and Bangladesh. I would expect them to have a large presence within Pakistan, for example. But I'm sorry, I can't give a reasonable answer to that question.
Thank you, David. And now jumping for something quite different that you mentioned, the issue of hydroxychloroquine. Well, just let me tell you that I have been accompanying a bit the international debate on the issue. It's absolutely fantastic that a medicine that is perhaps after aspirin and perhaps some one or other antibiotic is the most widespread and has been around for 70 years. Millions of people, I mean, me for instance, I took it so many times going to Africa, and now suddenly there are several studies that prove that it can make part of a solution to combat the virus. And then there was a tremendous campaign launched by a lot of press, especially press that has connections with big pharmaceutical interests, saying, "Oh no, hydroxychloroquine is killing people." And then, "Oh, it's President Trump said it was good, so President Trump is bad, so shouldn't take it." Well, it has been really unbelievable, the campaign against this hydroxychloroquine. But we have a specific question from Hannah Matadali. Anna Matadali, she's a researcher with us and advisor and researcher with us, and she would like to know if India can, you already mentioned that India is using this medication as part of its strategy, but do you think it really will be important in competing with China, the capacity of India to produce hydroxychloroquine?
Look, I'm obviously not a medical specialist, but I think that for a period when chloroquine was being promoted, certainly by Trump and some other countries, that India saw an opportunity to use its position as a major producer of chloroquine to provide a niche in terms of being able to undertake its own form of face mask diplomacy using hydrochloroquine. And my understanding is that the Modi offered to or donated some $10 million to a fund for being operated through SARC as part of his efforts to show regional leadership and that, in a time of crisis, etc. And those funds are being used to purchase Indian chloroquine to provide to some of the regional states. Frankly, I don't think that it will have a serious impact, particularly given that a number of these island states, they're certainly not at the moment suffering significant amounts of COVID cases. I think it's just I think I would take a fairly cynical view and think it's just it's a nice bit of PR. It's a way of India being able to show that it's providing medicines. I have some doubts that they'll actually be used, and I think that the real, as I mentioned in my presentation, I think the real, the important moves will not be these symbolic opening moves, but will be the real financial efforts. Will India be willing to step up and either provide money out of its own pocket or to organise other wealthier countries to provide money to states in need? That's what's going to be remembered, I think, throughout the region and have a long-term impact across the region.
Well, thank you very much, David. And we will now go back to Dr. Siegfried Wolf. He is pointing out that you mentioned potential multilateral attempts to some countries to discuss with Beijing debt release. Could you see as imaginable that the Pakistani authorities could join any sort of multilateral group discussing debt relief with China? Or do you think Pakistan will certainly remain only at the bilateral level?
Yeah, well, that's a very interesting question. I mean, obviously Pakistan was involved in debt relief negotiations with the G20, which involved China. But and as part of that, I think there were undertakings given by China to forgive or reschedule some debt. But I think when the details of that actually came out, the amounts of debt that the major lenders from China were actually excluded from that, and so that action in itself didn't give the Pakistan much relief. I think would, for example, potentially Pakistan organise other borrowers from the region to negotiate with China in terms of debt relief? I sort of doubt it, and the reason is because I think Pakistan has a huge amount of leverage by itself with China. The CPEC, because the CPEC is so high profile and is really the flagship part of the BRI, that China is really China just simply cannot afford to let CPEC fail. And it can't afford to let Pakistan being China's only real ally in the Indian Ocean region, I don't think China can afford to allow Pakistan to, suffer very severe financial distress. I think China and Pakistan are now so closely wedded that they need each other, including through the CPEC project. And so I think Pakistan will come out of any debt rescheduling negotiations with Beijing very well. That, nevertheless, I think there certainly is potential for other countries, other smaller countries, to group together to try and negotiate a better deal with China. Perhaps you could see countries like Sri Lanka, putting together a group of countries. But I think that would be a fair way down the road.
Thank you very much, David, for this all these very good answers, very adapted to the questions asked. I have not at the moment any other question from our audience. We still have some minutes to go, so if somebody wants to raise some last-minute question, please do it. I would just like to remind you that next Thursday next week, the 28th of May, at 11 UTC time, that means 1 p.m. here in Brussels, we will have Professor Christophe Jaffrelot that will speak to us on the COVID-19 crisis, long-term trends, the post-COVID-19 crisis, long-term trends in India. So we will be focusing specifically on India. I don't know if there is anybody want to have any last-minute question. Well, if not, just let me get this opportunity to once again express to David how thankful we are for all the guidance he gave us and all the input. Oh, I'm getting here some questions. So 2 questions. One from Dr. Wolf. Do you think there will be what can be the impact of a World Health Organization probe on this the context of the China-India relation? Well, the other question is coming from Dr. Dentinho. He is a bit asking you to sum up, because it's fundamentally what you have been speaking about. Summing up your intervention, do you think who is really winning the argument on this, on this diplomacy, COVID diplomacy rivalry, India or China?
Okay, well, on the WHO question, obviously it's of significant interest to us in Australia. Australia really took a leading role in the world in calling for a WHO inquiry, and I suppose we really stuck our chin out on that one, and we've been hit very badly by China. China is imposing sanctions on many billions of dollars worth of trade with Australia. I would say that's a major error on China's part, a huge error, because it just automatically destroys decades of work that China has been putting into trying to show itself as a reliable and benign partner. And it's just I find it quite unbelievable that China would be doing something really quite so stupid. as to destroy its relationship and image with the Australian public, because certainly Australia is not going to be cowed by that sort of bullying behaviour. That's really, I suppose, just a bit of an aside. But I think overall, in terms of international opinion, the view here would be that China is really doing quite badly in the court of public opinion, that its face mask diplomacy that it undertook in April was really didn't go anywhere, didn't achieve anything, and its efforts to avoid an international inquiry as to what occurred was entirely self-defeating. And it's quite interesting that so quickly China had to retreat from its position in opposing an inquiry, and it's now agreed to an inquiry. It was interesting that, obviously, and sort of coincidental, I suppose, that there's an Indian chair. Indian has taken the chair of the WHO right at this point in time, and I'm not aware to what extent India was working behind the scenes in terms of pulling together a coalition of countries in relation to an inquiry, but I don't think, to my knowledge, and I'm happy to stand corrected, I'm not sure that India took a significant public position on the inquiry. That's sort of, I suppose, standard Indian modus operandi. But certainly its role as, or having a national as chair of the WHO, puts it in a very important position in terms of the process of this inquiry. I don't otherwise see it being, at least in the broader international community, there being much of a contest between India and China. And as I basically the theme of my presentation is that we're only going to see India shifting regional opinion on a permanent basis if it is able to mobilize significant financial resources and goes beyond these initial moves in terms of some symbolic medical supplies.
Yes, thank you very much, David. I fully agree with this last sentence of yours. It really it requires a muscle that is not easy to have. And I would sum up what you said, just saying that, well, after all, the face mask diplomacy could not hide the wolf warrior diplomacy.
Yeah, right.
That is showing its teeth in a very obvious way, especially with Australia. And by the way, many congratulations to Australia for your firm position. I think that the whole world needs a credible WHO, and your initiative is a remarkable step on this direction. You really should be congratulated by everyone. We still have a last question. It's coming from Ms. Nahida Shumona. Well, she is inquiring. I doubt you can answer, Mrs. Shumona, but it's an interesting thing. She says that in Bangladesh, doctors found that ivermectin, it's a drug I'm not acquainted with, is more powerful, is more efficient than hydroxychloroquine. But she says, well, this has not been recognized in the international arena. Do you know why? Well, I suspect you do not know. You are not a doctor. Me either, I do not know. But I would give a hint saying that, I mean, hydroxychloroquine has been for decades one of the most widely taken medicines. So when you are in a situation of crisis, you will use something that has been widely tried and you know that does not have big side effects. Of course, you can die with it. You can die with aspirin,
Yeah.
you can die with everything if you take it in huge quantities. Apparently, that was done in some places to prove that it was not safe. But I don't know, David, do you have something?
Oh, look, if I may have this wrong, that might be a reference to some cases. I think that might be the drug for head lice, if that's being used in combination of with doxycycline. Obviously, you know, if that works, we will give a great round of applause. And obviously, you know, where I think everyone in the world is on the same page in terms of hoping that one of these drugs will, for whatever reason, be found to work and can be deployed very quickly.
Yes, absolutely so, David. I think that all of us, we agree with you on this point, and we hope, I think that all of us, we also agree that we hope that we will get out of this crisis mode as soon as possible. I think that you gave a brilliant conference. You were a great help, as always, to our work. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Very good evening to you in Sydney. All the best for Australia, your lovely country.
Thank you, Paolo.
We are looking forward to seeing you in the near future. And to all of you that participated, raising questions or just listening to us, thank you very much for your contributions. Once again, we will be again with a webinar on the 28th this month. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Paolo, and best wishes to our friends in Brussels and Europe.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.